So, yeah, thank you so much. This is our Coffee and Climate, Urban Heat and the Power of Trees. We have our presenters this morning. Sheba Brown is the Community Science Program Manager with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. We also have Tatyana Vashchenko who is a program manager with the Portland Parks and Rec Department. And then also in attendance, I just wanted to point out that we have Mark Ryland, who's our city uh, arborist with the city of Portland, who's also here to answer questions and chime in as you see. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Sheba to speak a little bit about the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and their urban heat mapping program. You might be muted.
Hi, I'm sorry. Give me just a moment to get my screen share set up. So I'm Sheba Brown, Gulf of Maine Research Institute, coming to you live from Eastport today. Um, so yeah, Urban Heat. It's a project that has been sort of a interest of mine for quite some time. When I started with GMRI, they wanted me to look at different projects we could start and different ways that we could engage communities in community science, also known as citizen science, but we call it community science. I'm going to share my screen because we now have a little more web presence in my program, which is new. It started a year and a half ago with my hire. So sharing my screen. So this is our brand new community science program page. Has all the information and projects that we're doing. And we have a lot of definitions. I'm going to skip all that and go to the good stuff, which is our urban heat island mapping project. I know a link was shared for this new page. It's so basically what I'd like to do. For those who don't know about urban heat islands, it's an urban area that has a higher temperature than it would if it was like a natural landscape or like a undeveloped landscape. So, you know, asphalt and buildings can change the temperature of the neighborhoods that we live in. And there is a lot of evidence to show that like having more trees and having more like painting roofs white and things like that can help reduce the effect. But I mean, it's to the point where like, in an urban area, the temperature can be like, 5-10 degrees higher than it is in like an outlying wooded area on the same day. And some of those materials in urban environments can also retain heat and like keep emitting heat into the evening. And so it stays hot. And there are a lot of like adverse health outcomes that come from that. There's a lot of research, and I know that there's been some stuff in the Press Herald about some of the work that's been done by another organization, but funnily enough, with folks that I do know and I talk to. And that work is really critical to understand. And in Portland in particular, when we think about our urban landscape, one, there's a lot of areas that don't have a ton of trees, and also it's warming. The Gulf of Maine itself is warming very rapidly, and we have evidence to show that. GMRI has done a lot of that research on sea surface temperature and rising temperatures in the Gulf of Maine waters. But we're also seeing warmer summers. And for those of you who don't know, I did used to work at the city of Portland with Aaron and Troy. And I would get calls about how hot it was, or, broken air conditioning, or like, why don't we have air conditioning here? It's because it didn't used to get this hot. Um, and so this is a really interesting place to look at climate adaptation and look at like our environment in Portland and South Portland as well, is to really look at climate adaptation, look at ways that we can, have better health outcomes, have people not going into the hospital with heat stroke. How can we prevent that? How can we make that better? And part of that starts with having really good on the ground data. So we have a lot of satellite data showing like where it's hotter. But what I'd like to do is have, the handheld sensors at ground level 3 times during a day during like a high heat event to really look at like what's the experience of people on the ground and like where is like a building blocking wind flow that it's super hot. You don't find those things unless you're ground truthing your data and like really looking at a granular level at like what are people experiencing and what's the air temperature because that's what we experience. So that is urban heat in a nutshell. We've submitted a grant. We've submitted a proposal to NASA. We're looking at some other proposals as well to try and fund this. And my current funding will fund part of the work we'd like to do. But we're looking for partners. We're looking for folks who want to advise on, we call them transects, basically the route that a car will take, like in the morning, in the middle of the day, and in the evening. Um, so like what neighborhoods are important for us to talk about, like what areas are of critical need, and looking at demographics as well. And we're looking to partner with anybody who is interested in that work and who wants to talk to us about it or knows somebody who has a science background and is really interested in this work and is in the area. So yeah, this is urban heat mapping, and I believe Erin can share some of this stuff when we get back or afterwards. All right, I will stop share and take questions, or I don't know what's next.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheba. Yeah, I will share those links in a follow-up email. But for right now, I think maybe we can hold questions and pass it over to Tatyana to talk a little bit more about the tree planting projects that are going on in Portland. And then we can hold questions until after the presentations.
Sounds good. So I will take a moment to share my screen here. And hopefully it's appeared. Okay, awesome. So Sheba was describing the need for analysis and studying this like complicated problem that has many sources. And what I'll talk about is how we're tackling one of the solutions. And there's multiple solutions, reducing the amount of dark surfaces and dark pavement, reducing the amount of pavement in general is going to be an important and complicated one to tackle. And planting more trees is a really straightforward one that offers many benefits beyond alleviating heat island effect. So I'm going to talk about the Bayside Street Tree Planting Project, which some of you may have heard about. Parks has been highlighting it as we've seen progress over the past neighborhood. If you live in the Bayside neighborhood, you might be seeing trees popping up here and there, and some cones and workers getting things installed. So also, I'm Tatyana. I'm with the Parks Division. I'm a project manager, and this is one of my projects that I'm shepherding this year. So before I dive into the project itself, I'll just note that there's a lot of different ways that the city plants trees around the city. So it generally happens 4 ways. There's the co-op and memorial planting program that generally gets about 35 trees into public spaces. There's the annual forestry division spring and fall planting effort that gets 150 to 200 trees in the ground. There are grant funded and collaborative like volunteer opportunities. Sometimes an organization will want to donate and time and money towards planting trees. We usually get around 35 trees in that way. And then special projects that pop up here and there, like this one. This year we are anticipating planting at least 155 trees. And so this project is funded by 2 sources: American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, which actually was what funded a lot of the initial analysis that's really interesting, and that makes this a pilot program. Community Development Block Grant also funded some of the construction documentation and some of the planting sites, specifically focusing on planting in low to moderate income residential areas. So some of the funding is going towards those specific planting opportunities. So I'll talk about the process. This is a unique project because As part of it, we worked with a consultant, Sebago Technics, to roll out a somewhat sophisticated approach to identifying planting opportunities and prioritizing them. So what you're looking at here is a partial map of the Bayside neighborhood. The dashed line describes the limits of that neighborhood. And the color coding that you see is what's used to rank planting site viability or opportunities. And that is a combination of several factors and ratings that our consultant generated. Two primarily are rating the degree of canopy need. So is there a high need of canopy because there is no tree canopy on that street? Or is there a low need because it's actually pretty well covered with existing trees, whether they're in someone's side yard and overarching the street or right in the street right of way? So that was one primary factor, is evaluating the degree of need. And the other factor that was really critical is considering the sidewalk conditions and whether there was a viable opportunity to plant a tree. And so for that, our consultants used the city's sidewalk database, looking at what is the width of a sidewalk? Can we get a wheelchair through there if we plant a tree? So are we accommodating accessibility? What is the condition of that sidewalk? Is this a street that's really due for like a full rebuild because it is not functioning all that well yet? Or is there a project coming up that is going to already be planting trees or redeveloping a sidewalk, in which case by planting a tree now, we'd likely see it ripped out a year from now, or that sidewalk ripped out a year from now. It'd be a waste of resources. So the color coding of viability from maximum to minimal combines all of those ratings and starts to identify areas within residential zones that are particularly high priority or high viability for planting, and in non-residential areas. And we differentiated those because there was a desire to emphasize residential areas for planting, and the non-residential would be additional planting that we would be able to accomplish with the available funding. So from there, we moved towards prioritizing those sites given the available funds that we had. And so that meant identifying actual individual planting opportunities. So each of these pins in the background is on a interactive Google Earth map, identifying a planting opportunity and identifying it as viable, meaning like it's an esplanade that exists and you can get a tree in there without ripping out sidewalk. Viable too, meaning like, I think you're gonna need to bring some equipment in to stump grind, or there's some added heavy work that's needed to get this plant in. Existing tree well, that's like the low hanging fruit. This tree died for various reasons, salt possibly, somebody pulling it down, pulling it out, or a car crashing into it, all common events. Minor infrastructure would be a situation where we need to cut out a piece of concrete sidewalk, asphalt sidewalk, or brick. Major infrastructure would be a condition where we think the street is a candidate for reconstruction. And we being, that's the Parks Department talking to the Public Works Department and identifying that the street is in poor condition, their sidewalks are too narrow, we'd need actual bump outs to get trees in there, surviving in the long term. Private planting would be situations where there are good opportunities for planting a tree that would improve the public realm and the right of way, but it's private property. So this is maybe a site where parks can reach out to that property owner, encourage them to participate in the co-op planting program. Tree fund candidate, these are maybe city properties where we can already, like we have the ability to leverage existing funds to plant trees. Public entity would be a site that might be Portland Housing Authority, where rather than planting a tree in a small tree well in a sidewalk, we could actually plant trees in the front yards of these Portland Housing Authority buildings. And that tree would likely succeed and grow twice as big and have all the same benefits for the street and neighborhood. And then planned planting are sites where we already know developers or other projects are planning to plant. And then we narrowed it all down to a number, and this is not the total that we're actually targeting, but this is from one of the maps of the sites that we're actually endeavoring to plant, which are the viable 2, existing tree wells, and minor infrastructure. So That's what's within the scope of the project. Then we field verified this all 1, 2, 3 times. I visited most of these sites more times than I can count on my hands, but it was several rounds of visiting each of these potential locations, confirming that it's a viable spot, looking at overhead wires, making sure that this tree isn't likely to suffer the same end that its predecessor might have, where we're replanting existing trees. Here we have Sebago Technics and city arborist, current and former, demonstrating a tree location for our records. Finally, the penultimate stage is documenting all this so that a contractor could actually take these instructions and build what we want them to. So that's identifying each of these locations. This particular snippet that you see in the background is on Oxford Street, next to some community gardens. These were existing tree wells that were quite small, and so we're looking at expanding them, so doubling their size, and providing information on what size those should be, what it would take to cut those out, whether there's overhead wires to worry about, and what kind of tree we're looking to plant there. And finally, we're at this stage currently. We have a team of contractors out in the field, myself checking on these, a community tree steward watering all these trees in, and our city arborist constantly checking in on the project. The trees are actually going in, sidewalk is getting ripped out, and we're starting to see some of them begin their slow path towards establishment. The first year is the tough year for trees. So our emphasis during planting is really on resilient tree selection. It's on a few things, but selecting the right trees is a big deal. And we are working to emphasize Northeast and Southeast natives. And the reason we're looking at natives to areas that are hotter than ours is precisely for the reasons just outlined by Sheba. Heat island effect makes cities a hotter place than an undeveloped patch of woodland or meadow. And so we actually need trees that can deal with that higher heat. And we're also looking to the fact that there's climate change to contend with. So we're finding some of these Southeastern natives are doing quite well. In fact, what you see in this image here is an American smoke tree, really lovely rounded foliage. We're finding that that tree in particular is just being an amazing survivor of the hot, dry conditions on our staging area. We're watering these trees every day, but still a tough condition for a bald and burlap tree to survive. And the smoke tree in general is just doing really well with the heat that we're experiencing in July. Some of the trees that we're getting into the ground this year are also kind of experiments. Maybe they're not used commonly for street trees in Maine. We're looking to study how well they do. And hopefully based on the outcomes of this project, we could steer our street tree canopy towards more natives and try to balance the species composition that we currently have. One of the things that Mark's been looking at, I don't know if you want to jump in here, is the proportions of different species and families within our existing tree canopy and trying to prevent any one species from really dominating our tree canopy and making us vulnerable to pests and canopy loss. Mark, if you'd like to jump in and share anything on that.
Yep, that's why we had quite a spread of species, because for maintaining like healthy from a global perspective, the healthy urban forest, we want to make sure we're balancing not just individual species, but also botanical family. So we've got, or not just botanical family, but also genus. So there's 3 levels of kind of variation we're trying to accomplish, and that's particularly with this project. Bayside neighborhood is a pretty heavily urbanized area, so there's a lot of overhead utilities. So in a lot of the places where we were trying to plant trees, we are limited to the smaller growth form trees that can fit in underneath wires. And for our recommended tree list, which the city has, which is based on recommendations from Arbor Day, the International Society of Arboriculture, CMP has an entire forestry division that helps determine small trees to put under power lines. One of the issues is all of those trees are in this same botanical family, which can be a problem. Specifically for that botanical family would be like brown tail moth. They're all host species. So trying to look at, when the project was getting underway, say we had 155 identified planting spots. And, I'm making some of these numbers up, but say like 75 or 80 of them required a small growth form tree in order to fit underneath existing infrastructure. So if we had stuck with kind of our historical paradigm of the smaller tree list that goes in there, we would have had a very heavy weight towards that particular botanical family, which would have been we had like a large geographical spread of like brown tail moth host. So that's where we, especially with the smaller trees, started deviating when the new USDA plant hardiness zone map came out last year. We actually bumped up a hardiness zone into a warmer zone. And so taking that into account, along with everything Sheba talked about with the urban heat island effects, really trying to find trees that would give us the species and botanical family diversity we need, but also be able to survive in frankly a harsh environment. And so that's why some of the southeastern trees seem to be dealing with the heat and the water dynamics a little better, but are still hardy down to, we tried to have at least one hardiness zone buffer for the winter hardiness. So even, American smoke tree would be, I believe is hardy down to like zone 4B, which gives us an entire temperature range of buffering area. So we're optimistic. We're trying a couple new things, but this is a perfect project for it. So.
Absolutely. And when we get to questions, folks who are maybe unfamiliar with some of these species, feel free to ask about them, and we can share what we know about them to the extent possible. A couple other considerations that are key to us as we get these trees installed, and I'm near the end of my presentation here, is really looking at providing good quality soil and maximizing soil volume. So I'm sure if you pay attention to the sidewalk when you navigate it, you've probably noticed that some tree wells are tiny, and yet we have trees that seem to be thriving, in particular in older neighborhoods. And some tree wells are tiny and the tree just seems like it's stunted and it's not growing. And there's a lot of different factors to why that is. But some of those older neighborhoods, the pavement is built like a thin layer on top of soil. Nowadays, and usually that pavement is in rough condition, isn't super ADA accessible. On the flip side, nowadays, we are building our brick sidewalks, concrete sidewalks, asphalt sidewalks on a much deeper bed of compacted aggregate base, which is good for maintaining accessibility and durable sidewalks, and really tough on allowing roots to penetrate through. And so it becomes imperative that as we upgrade our approach to building solid sidewalks, we also provide ample room for those tree roots to expand into. We can't leave those same tiny tree wells that we used to install for trees and expect them to mature. In addition to that, silt is a really big challenge to tree establishment in urban areas, especially when the soil that's available is really limited and compacted. So again, that adds the impetus for a much larger soil volume for root trees, for tree roots to expand into. So this photo on the left is our staging area in Bayside. In the background, we have the material that's been removed from the tree well. So as we go in to install these trees, we're actually removing all of the soil in them down to 3 feet if utilities allow, and replacing it with new soil. And granted, most people are aware that tree roots stay in the top like 18 inches generally. Some people don't know that, but the deeper soil that we're providing is also intended to allow for better drainage. And so when that salt gets into the tree well, it has the ability to percolate through. There's also considerations to the amount of humus in the soil and how that affects like the binding versus porosity or cation exchange capacity in relation to salt. And that's not my expertise, but it's more something Mark could speak to if people are curious and have questions. This photo on the lower right is an example of what we take out of tree wells. It's really amazing, you know, between contractors and people planting trees in their own sidewalk strips. They don't always realize what lies beneath the top few inches. In some cases, trees are planted and there's just pavement a few inches down. Last but not least, I think this is last but not least, we are really emphasizing with our contractor and our own planting practices, proper planting practices, meaning exposing the root crown. So you excavate away a lot of the soil that gets piled up against the base of the tree when planting. You need to make sure that that root flare that you can like usually see on an older tree is right at the surface, and it really impacts how well the tree is able to get established. So that if it's planted too deep, oftentimes I've learned from Mark that the tree will actually see most of its root material die off and rot and have to reestablish roots higher up near the surface of the soil. And that really slows down its establishment, sometimes sets it back significantly. And last but not least, this may seem really reasonable and normal, but a lot of times it doesn't happen. Removing the burlap and the metal cage around the plant when you plant it, and most people who are planting trees in their yard are going to be using containerized trees. This is almost akin to like planting your tree with the pot and forgetting to remove the pot. This happens a lot too, and as a result the trees are kind of stunted and bonsai'd right in place. Last but not least, the project status now is we've planted around 95 trees, about 26 species and varieties in total. We have 155 total that we're aiming for before the end of fall. So we are a little bit past halfway. And we have a hardworking community tree steward out there watering every single day into the evening that you may see around the Bayside neighborhood. This is Matt Galvin saying hello. We're very grateful. Tree establishment takes about 2 years, and that watering is very essential. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Open to questions and answers.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of information, but incredibly interesting. And I know you could probably speak for another hour on everything that's going on. So yeah, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess Bill Weber with Portland Climate Action Team. Question primarily to Sheba, whether the science has, in terms of your heat sinks, whether the science has evolved to where you can model what new developments occur, what impact new developments have, and whether we should require developers to do that study so that they can then come up with some mitigation for the problem that they're imposing upon us. If you could speak to that, thank you.
So the short answer is I don't know. I'm not the scientist. I'm more of a compiler and convener. But if you want, you can email me. I think Erin can share my email after this, and like definitely follow up with me. I can try and track down we have a lot of data modelers in our in-house, and so I can probably ask them kind of where that is.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a pretty important thing for our planning department to consider as we look at building out, especially like Franklin Arterial. You know, the first thing you do when you want to stop digging a hole is you stop digging, right? So, you know, future development, if we're not mitigating the impact, that's a problem. And secondly, I guess I wonder, you know, we have a housing trust. Should the city of Portland establish a tree trust that's supported by developers? I don't know if anybody, Troy, if you've heard of anything like that, maybe that's something that we really need to establish or go forward with now.
I'm going to let Mark talk about the tree trust, but I did want to point out, as part of the proposed resilience recode effort, people may have heard of the flooding resilience overlay zone. There's also two other overlay zones proposed as part of recode, and one is a heat overlay zone that's citywide that will require developers to consider urban heat island impacts for developments and lots of standards. So I think I'll have Aaron include a link to information about the proposed overlay zones in the package, so folks can read up about that. And there's still some opportunity to comment about it. So that might be good information. And I don't know if Mark, you want to talk about the tree trust.
Yep. So we actually have two different tree funds in the city. We have one that is specifically for instance, development projects. All the like street tree requirements are tied, depending on what type of development is, it's either tied to the number of residential units that are going in, or just the linear length of public right-of-way frontage that they have. So for instance, like an apartment building going in with like 100 units, each one of those units would carry a street tree requirement. However, their lots are definitely not big enough to plant 100 street trees. So depending on what their frontage is, say they could fit, 10 street trees in. They plant those 10, they still have a street tree requirement of 90. We do have a monetary value that we assign to a single street tree. So they basically just cut a check of 90 trees times that value to the city, and that goes directly into the tree fund. And that's what for our spring and fall planting, that's at what we draw off of to purchase the 150 to 200 trees, as well as all the like planting medium, all that new soil mix, most of that for at least the forestry's internal city planting. Almost all of that is funded through the tree trust that is replenished by the development projects. And then there's a separate fund that is more for individual residents who basically all of our tree work permits, all of our fines, fees, which we don't really do a whole lot of. But the big thing is if anybody wanted to donate to the forestry program in order to support tree planting, there's a separate account that is just for like citizen donations. So we do have a tree trust and a tree fund that supports our annual plantings.
Great questions. Definitely keep, raise your hand or just unmute and ask a question if you have one. Sheba, I wanted to just kind of clarify um, the project that you're working on. That's going to be both in Portland and South Portland. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's where we'd like to pilot. Sort of my larger goal is to bring this to communities across the state, but we figure we have to start somewhere, and
Yeah.
Portland, South Portland seemed like a good spot since we have the infrastructure and we know people, and that's where it's where our headquarters is located.
And not only is it going to be like people having their own monitors, but there's monitors on buildings within the city, correct? Or is that a separate project?
No, it's all kind of part of it. We're trying to get some data, but in the fall, we're gonna start working with schools and seeing if they can install sensors connected to the purple air sensors need a Wi-Fi connection in order to work. And so at the moment, our buildings are big metal boxes, and so the signal isn't going through them. So we're trying to find solutions, and we're hoping that the schools can help us there. And obviously you guys, because you guys have a sensor.
Cool.
A question for Mark and Tatyana. As you're doing the Bayside project, is there like anything that, like, what's the most surprising thing you've sort of discovered through the process, or most interesting thing you've learned about, planting in that environment?
Well, I guess I don't know if I should call this surprising, but I think the first 5 planting sites we started with turned out to have like a foot of concrete in existing tree wells. And so while our contractors came in like with a soil auger, it's basically like a big screw that comes in and pulls soil out. They actually had to come back with a jackhammer to get the trees in. And it was a good example of just like when sidewalk projects, when developments are happening, you really have to keep eyes on the contractor to ensure that like inappropriate things like pouring concrete into what will be a future tree well doesn't happen. So anyway, that was thankfully not every tree well, but it was quite the initiation into how difficult planting one tree could be.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. The biggest surprise for me has really been just the extent of the, I mean, for lack of a better word, the trash that the trees are planted in. I mean, looking closely at the used or this old soil pile that has been excavated out, soil is not really the word to use. It's it's this, slurry or mix of fill materials and base layers for foundations, and where the concrete truck cleaned out the chute after it was done with the pour. So it's just, on a lot of the projects, there's really just the final step would be a quick skim coat of loam, a couple inches deep, just enough to take like grass seed root. But as far as like trees go, there's not a whole lot of nutritive medium under those sidewalks for them to draw from. Which is why we see like really, really long establishment periods if they get established, and then, stunted growth and generally, unhealthier looking specimens.
Bill?
Yeah, I apologize for taking another bite at the apple here. Civil engineers often give cities, states grades. And I'm wondering, Mark, is there any kind of organization that would give the city of Portland a grade for tree canopies, or what's your honest assessment? I remember in the fall, was it just last fall or 2 years ago, when Mayor Dion, at the time a candidate, said, well, what are we going to do about climate change? He said, well, we should plant more trees. So I guess I'm wondering whether we're putting enough pressure on the mayor and the city council to plant more trees. But again, if you're happy, if you think we deserve an A, great. But I'm wondering, is there a subjective analysis of where we stand with that? Thank you.
So kind of two parts to the question. So as far as I know, we don't have or the city of Portland doesn't necessarily have a grade from like a civil engineering body, but we do have the tree equity score, which is the national program based off of census data, and so Portland itself, composite score over all the different census tracts. The composite tree equity score is about 87 out of 100. And so, but that's a little misleading because there's a pretty wide variance. For instance, the Bayside neighborhoods have scores in, I believe it's the 40s. So they are several standard deviations below the mean. And then also Areas like the West End have a equity score of roughly 100, and that's mostly what it takes into account is the actual presence of tree canopy cover, a percentage of tree canopy cover, but then also a lot of census demographics. So, household income, things like that. And so that helps us or serves as the initial like analytics for pointing us in the right direction of like where trees are needed more to experience all those fringe benefits. Now that I've been in the position for a year, I think the numbers that we're planting are pretty well that is a good target number to given the amount of resources we have and the crews that we have to get roughly 150 to 200 trees into the ground in a fashion that they will survive. The bigger issue we're finding is especially in places or the areas of the city that need trees the most, we may not have viable planting sites, or there may be open space for them. But as we said, once you take literally one shovelful out, you're in, I mean, no telling what is underneath there. And so that's why we're really focusing on like bringing in good soil volume where we can, things of that nature. We're working with trying to lean on or work collaboratively with our own DPW about just kind of changing the thought process for like sidewalk heaving and how we're going to address that. And so instead of cutting, buttress roots, we're trying to accommodate them. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done as far as site improvements and general public education for the importance and role that trees are really trying to play in our overall climate plan. Um, from my personal experience over the past year, we have within the city pretty, I mean, across the board, unanimous support that tree planting is worthwhile. The benefits of trees are worth investing in. The bigger challenge is just how do we logistically manage all of this? Because I'm not super comfortable with planting a tree in a site where I know it's not going to do well. I'd rather hold off on planting it there until we have a chance to coordinate with all the other various departments and get some site improvements done. But I think that as far as the big first step challenge is always hearts and minds of the leadership, and I think we've got that step. The leadership all the way from the mayor down is very supportive of everything we're doing. And so it's really just figuring out the best way to go about it. There's not a whole lot of arguing and convincing back and forth that, hey, it's worthwhile to plant trees. Everybody's kind of already got that mindset. As far as the city leadership goes, it's really just how do we do this in the most effective way to really provide the most benefit to the general public.
Frederick, you have a question?
Hi, thanks. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for the conversation. It's really great. Around salt, I was curious about that. Like, what's the mitigation? I mean, that's harmful for the trees, right? So both, I guess, from what's happening from the municipal level, road salts, and then also like, residents that are salting their sidewalks and kind of just in general, are there mitigations, that are being implemented now, or how does that work?
So yeah, I mean, for trees, salt is a big problem. Chemically, it salt water into the soil profile. It readily ionizes into if you think table salt like sodium and chlorine free ions. The sodium ions are the troublesome ones because they actually bond to all the positive bonding sites in the soil. like Tatyana was explaining, with cation exchange capacity. So it makes it difficult for the trees to take in water. That's why you call like salt burn, is where the fringes of the leaves start turning brown, because it's basically interrupted the entire nutrient translocation process, but also it can break down soil structure. So in the tree wells where there's not a whole lot of organic matter to begin with, there's not a whole lot of humus, that kind of spongy material that facilitates soil porosity. As saltwater drains into those tree wells, that soil structure starts to break down. You start to get a much more compacted and dense soil substrate, which just exacerbates all the general problems that urban trees face. And so ideally would be, pie in the sky solution would be like, well, let's not use salt anymore. That's probably not going to get a whole lot of traction, just because it's a necessary evil, especially for winter road management. Um, so there's been a few different solutions investigated. One that is effective from the standpoint of keeping salt out of the tree wells is the raised granite tree planters, where the granite border is actually proud or protrudes from the sidewalk grade. Those are very effective at keeping salt out of the tree well. However, they add quite a substantial expense to the construction of the tree well, and they're very challenging in particularly a place like Bayside, where we already have narrow right-of-ways, to maintain ADA access. We can't, shrink the sidewalk down by having a granite curb, mid-sidewalk. So with this project, or the Bayside specifically, a lot of those species that we're drawing from a little bit further south, a lot of those are salt tolerant. They grow or have the ability to grow in brackish environments. So hopefully if there is some salt concentration in the soil, they will, just by their evolutionary advantage, be able to mitigate that a little better. And then also the big thing is bringing in bringing in substantial volume of actual soil. One, bringing it down to a depth so that we don't hit like a hard pan where all that salt water is draining into the tree well, and maybe the top 18, 24 inches is relatively permeable, but then you just hit that hard pan from years and years of construction projects. So you get like a saltwater lens that just sits in the tree well. And so by breaking up the compaction in there and bringing in hopefully much more or a planting mix that has a much greater level of soil activity, chemical activity, that will be able to buffer that salt out much more effectively, as well as actually drain through the profile. So that's kind of our mindset for this particular project. I'm still working on, outlawing salts, but I don't know how much traction I'm going to get on that. But yeah, salt is it is one of the abiotic disorders that the trees really struggle with. And so by addressing hopefully soil volume to begin with, that should help alleviate it a little bit. And then through other, species selection and just trying to change, winter ops practices. As far as there's not much we can do for the salt slingers on the roads, but the sidewalks and the downtown area, if they're exploring literally any other option to salt that's just going to drain directly into the tree wells, is a priority at this point.
Mark?
I have a comment and two questions. My comment is I applaud the city in your efforts to promote this daunting task, to say the least. And my two questions are, and I think Mark Ryland maybe hit on the first one, but can you comment a little bit more on the sustainability of this effort going forward in terms of budget and labor shortage and all that? Is this does this look like it's going to continue into the future? And secondly, the images of the people out on the street that we saw earlier in the high visibility vests, the contractors that are actually doing the work, are those Sebago Technics employees? Are they city Department of Public Works employees? Are they both? Thank you.
So the contractors that are actually doing the work are Nelson Property Services. It was went through a bid process. Tatyana can speak a little more to that. The other question, which I'm sorry, I have like 8 different answers running around in my head right now. So labor moving forward, the project, the contract and everything is for, they are cutting in all the tree wells and planting the 155 trees. As far as the city side, we are responsible for the watering and the establishment watering, which this year we have a Maine Conservation Corps community tree steward who that is literally just working on this project alone. But moving forward, every year we hire probably 3 to 4 forestry seasonals who only work for us during the growing season. And they are tasked 100%. Their primary duty is watering all the trees that we have planted. We definitely water all the ones that were planted in the last 12 months. And then as we get through those, we expand that into the last 24 months. And usually we're able to water 100% of the trees that we planted in the last year, and usually well more than half of the trees that were planted 2 years ago, just to help in that establishment. So these 155 new trees that are being planted as the project are integrated into our seasonal watering schedule. And then just the general maintenance, would fall on our forestry crew. The good thing is newly planted trees, really you're kind of just watching them get established. We're doing a lot of the legwork with expanding the tree wells, bringing in more soil volume. We selected all the trees at the nursery to make sure we were getting good specimens. So we're really really trying to set the trees up for a high survivability rate and a high success rate with establishment, which in the urban setting can be a challenge. And Bayside neighborhood, I would say, absolutely qualifies as a particularly urban site. So we're crossing our fingers for long-term success with the project. And survivability, we're seeing a little bit of transplant shock just because we are planting straight through the hottest part of the year. But the daily watering is really helping us overcome a lot of that. And so we're hoping for and seeing, really high survivability rates at the moment.
Great. We have just a few minutes left. I had maybe just a follow-up question to Frederick's question about the salt. Mark, did you have any maybe like recommendation? It's okay if you don't, but what a homeowner would use instead of salt? I know that that's something that, we get questions about in our office sometimes, and I don't know if you had something that you would recommend.
I really, if there's any way you can do just straight mechanical clearing, so the snow shovel and
Mhm.
the the issue with salt in like soil chemistry is it's not necessarily like, oh, if you switched from like a sodium based product to a calcium based product, like a calcium chloride, or I believe there's magnesium chloride, basically like Epsom salt that's used as well. Um, all of those salts readily ionize in solution, and then they're all going to have a positive free ion that's going to bond in the soil profile, and is going to have similar effects as far as interfering with water uptake from the tree. So whether it's sodium, calcium, magnesium, you're going to get burning, foliar burning, and then also the same impacts on like soil structure. So it's really challenging to find a product that can be spread like that, that won't drain directly into the tree wells or grass. I mean, if it's a traction issue, what comes to mind would be like just use like regular sand, but then you're stuck with piles of sand everywhere. It's a tricky issue. If there's any way at all to, I mean, try to keep or prevent one, salt being applied directly into the tree wells, that's a huge help. And then also just being judicious, using the minimum amount of salt you need to maintain safe travel lanes. Just in anything like that is just limiting the amount that actually makes it into the soil, would be hugely helpful.
I'd like to just add to that. I would say that like going through all the neighborhoods when verifying planting sites, and earlier in the process talking to Jeff Tarling, who had been working for the city for 30 years, the real problem sites with salt are often sites that are managed by like a property management service and not by individual homeowners who have a stake in not using too much salt, because then they have to buy more and there's like more of a feedback loop, like they want to use just enough. And those are not the problem sites where we see trees dying from salt burn. It's really the sites like adjacent to apartment buildings and businesses where there's a overzealous employee like applying an inch of salt to the sidewalk, and so it's actually, I do think dialing back the quantity of salt could make a significant difference.
Thank you. Well, we're at an hour, so I just wanted to thank our presenters, Sheba and Tatyana and Mark. Thank you so much for all of your input today and all the information. I'm going to follow up with an email to everyone just with some of the links and topics that we talked about today. And then feel free to, respond to that with any questions, and we'll try to connect people with some answers. But thank you so much for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.